Here in a new paragraph, Isaiah continues his timeline for the last days. But these 4 verses, Isaiah 3:12 through 15, invite us to ask a question. Who is Isaiah talking about when he says that women and children will rule over his people and cause them to err? Who's he talking about when he says that the ancients or the elders of his people will eat up the vineyard and beat his people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor? In answering these questions, there are 2 things we should keep in mind. One, although it refers to God's covenant people, it doesn't refer to all of them. As we saw in verse 10, and as we'll see again in the next chapter, the righteous of the Lord's people are still being greatly blessed at this time. And 2, we need to remember that this is all happening after devastating destructions have racked the earth and people are just trying to survive. Also, these verses refer only to those covenant people who chose not to follow counsel and leave early. These verses only refer to those who are left behind when the righteous escaped. At this desperate time, many will claw and fight and even steal for food. In some family groups, women may lead them, and others, children or youths, will oppress them, as Isaiah says. But in all cases, survival will be their main goal. This will happen toward the beginning of Isaiah's timeline, but as with much of what he says, his words have meaning for all people in all ages. Look at verse 14. In the Book of Mormon, it says, "The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people and the princes thereof. For ye have eaten up the vineyard and the spoil of the poor in your houses." The word ancients refers to the elders of his people. And the word princes means their leaders, both civil and ecclesiastical. Isaiah is saying that these leaders have eaten the spoil of the poor in their homes. In their homes. One way to interpret this is that some leaders have consumed so many resources in the building of their homes that they've used up resources that could have been used to bless the poor. As the Lord once told a rich young man, "If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." But of course, the rich young man refused, because he found the Lord's counsel too hard to follow, and he went away sorrowful. Most people wouldn't mind being wealthy, but perhaps as the Lord's covenant people, we should focus more on our treasure in heaven than on our treasures on earth. One of the great dangers of wealth is that we'll be tempted to cleave to it when the Lord calls us to cleave to him. The prophet Lehi didn't hesitate when the Lord called him to take his family into the wilderness. On the other hand, Laban, a leader of the same people, didn't hesitate to grind the faces of the poor, especially the 4 sons of Lehi, when the opportunity arose. Likewise, it appears that many of the Lord's children today will be reluctant to leave their homes when the Lord calls. Remember, when the Lord called Lehi, all appeared to be well in Jerusalem. It wasn't at war, so why should he take his family into the wilderness? And yet, he humbly followed the counsel of the Lord, and his family was saved. If we are blessed with a degree of wealth, will we be able to leave it behind when the Lord counsels us through his anointed servants to leave for places unknown? Will we be able to leave our wealth to the moles and to the bats when the Lord calls us to follow him? And let's look at the other part of this. Do some of us, even some leaders, use our resources to grind the faces of the poor? Do we use oppressive business practices to get rich and then pay tithing on the profits? The day will come when many of us may have to choose between cleaving to our wealth or cleaving to the Lord. At that time, what will we do? Will we leave our wealth and cleave to the Lord? Or will we leave the Lord and cleave to our wealth? As Isaiah says, "The Lord standeth up to plead and to judge the people." As we prepare for these days to come, he's already pleading with us to follow him, even as he invited the rich young man to follow him. And soon, the Lord will stand up to judge the whole world including the elders and the princes thereof. Who will be prepared? Next time, as we continue reviewing Isaiah's timeline, we'll learn of the bitter, almost overwhelming trials that will come to the daughters of Zion in the last days. I'm Curtis Taylor with the Words of Isaiah.